Funding for the Hinckley Report is made possible in part by the Cleone Peterson Eccles Endowment Fund.
Tonight on the Hinckley Report. After a tumultuous year in politics, our panel weighs in on the top stories that had the biggest impact on Utahns. With new leaders in key positions, how have their policies impacted our state? As debates raged over science and politics, what lessons were learned? And with partisan rancor at historic levels, is there any room left for civility? Good evening, and welcome to the Hinckley Report. I'm Jason Perry, Director of the Hinckley Institute of Politics. Joining our panel tonight, we have Kate Bradshaw, member of the Bountiful City Council, Lindsay Whitehurst, reporter with the Associated Press, and Matt Canham, senior reporter with the Salt Lake Tribune. Thank you for being with us. This is an important show for us tonight. This is our year in review. We're going to talk about the big stories of the year, and what's interesting is as we think about this particular show, almost any one of these stories we're going to talk about tonight could be the story of the year. So many to talk about, but there are many that impact us on the national stage, the worldwide stage, but particularly on the Utah stage. And you all have covered stories so well this year. So I want to talk about what you think the big stories were and some of the implications. Matt, let's start with you. You've done some great reporting this past year. When you put all these stories there, give us one that you'd like to talk about that was particularly impactful that you covered.
I would say the biggest story of the year happened just 6 days into this year when thousands of pro-Donald Trump protesters attacked our U.S. Capitol. It was stunning to see, sickening to see. I was a D.C. correspondent for 7 years, and that's where I worked. The Capitol Police shot and killed a woman at the Speaker's lobby. That is where reporters interact with members of the House. In a regular day, I was there multiple times a day. It was stunning, and there were ties to every state in the nation, including Utah. A half dozen Utahns were among those who broke into the Capitol and now face federal charges. You had the president, Donald Trump, call Mike Lee on the Senate floor. Now, that might have been an accidental call, but reporting since has shown that the president and his team were lobbying Mike Lee to try to overthrow the election. And I will point out that Mike Lee voted to accept the electoral votes of every state. He did not go into that, but he was getting pressured. You had a Capitol Police officer potentially save Mitt Romney's life by directing him away from the people who were storming the Capitol. It was an absolutely stunning day.
Yeah, it was. Lindsay, talk about Mitt Romney there for just a moment, because it was historic. And the response that came, and his response was particularly pointed.
Right, and it came down to anger, frustration, and a little bit of I told you so. That warning he gave years ago, that this, he was afraid of perhaps not something like this, because I don't know if anyone imagined something like this happening, but this is where this rhetoric takes us. It seemed to be his message that day, and this is one of many stories that we're talking about as a major story for this year. It's not over yet. We keep learning new information. And charges are still, new charges are still coming down against people who entered the building. There are suspects who haven't been charged yet. So some of the lower level folks are being sentenced now, and some of those higher level people who are accused of more serious crimes have yet to even come to have yet to come to a head. So we're still seeing those cases play out in the criminal justice system. Mm-hmm. We're still seeing an inquiry in Congress and learning new things, the text messages that are coming out. So we are definitely going to still be talking about this in 2022, and I think I remember the feeling I had here in Utah was just trying to go about my day, but just feeling ill. Mm-hmm. Do you remember that feeling?
Yeah. I agree with you. Long ago I interned in Washington D.C. and I remember looking. My office was in the Cannon Building, and so I remember looking at those crowds and knowing exactly where that office was I worked at, and being involved in Utah politics. I have a number of very good friends that are on staff for our Utah delegation, and texting them to make sure they were okay, and being very worried because a number of them were in the Capitol. And so there was that added element of horror, but at a distance, being here in Utah, but then knowing that I had people I deeply cared about that were inside that building that I was really worried about that day.
Yeah. So there was the health and safety, which we felt also, but from the conversation from some of our elected officials, Kate, too, was interesting. So on the Mitt Romney side, it was not only are we risking lives, but this was, in his words, an attack against our democracy. Right. The foundations of our government itself.
Yeah, we pride ourselves on that peaceful transition of power. It allows us this stability, financial stability and political stability, that even when your team has lost, that you can accept that and move on and continue to build for that next election cycle. And that has allowed us to have tremendous prosperity for the whole history of our country, that we are able to do this.
Support our image around the world.
Yes, and we almost weren't able to do that. And I think it was... It was scary as a citizen, but for every level of government, whether you accept a city council race or a governor's race or a presidential race, we are layered on that system of those transitions, and we came close to not doing that, and I think that scared a lot of us, and was, as Senator Romney said, something that struck at the heart of who we think we are and who we tell the rest of the world we are.
Matt, as you interviewed people in the state of Utah, is this the feeling you're getting from them? I'm just kind of curious, when you're talking to them, the impacts.
The impacts change over time, and there are people who don't look at it as a significant or as a significant event as maybe I would. It's become political, right? There was a moment where Congress said, we need a commission to investigate this. And you had Representative Blake Moore and John Curtis from Utah vote for that. They were some of the few Republicans who did. But the Republicans in Congress blocked that commission from happening. There's now a committee in the House doing that investigation. It is bipartisan because there's 2 Republicans on it, most famously Liz Cheney from Wyoming. But both parties are not treating this as the same sort of attack on the democracy at this point. But it has soured relationships in Washington, even though I didn't know that was possible for those things to become more tense. It has. And what it actually means for our country, how this goes forward, politically is still up in the air. Criminally, and the Justice Department has called this the biggest investigation in its history into hundreds and hundreds of people. I mean, thousands of people marched in there. Some of them had weapons. Some of them stormed the House and Senate chambers. They called out the names of politicians. There was a had a noose that they were carrying around, calling for the vice president. There's video. It's stunning to see it, but the politics of it have overtaken that exact moment.
Just one last piece on this too, and Kate, talk about this, because the election, the results were accepted, the Electoral College here, which are the heart of some of this, but it wasn't exactly unanimous. There were some states and some members of Congress. There
were some states that felt like maybe there had been irregularities. Those have not necessarily proven out on a further analysis and study, but those ripples are still playing out, not just from that day on January 6th, but you have had different states that have had, Arizona, for instance, that have had their legislatures looking at election audits and wanting to do that, and that has continued to kind of foment some of this trust in our election process. And Utah hasn't been immune. We've had, legislators that have wanted to have the Utah legislature do something similar. There has
be an audit now.
Yeah, there is now a legislative audit of the election process that is moving forward, and you have concern from our governor, our lieutenant governor, in particular, Deidre Henderson, whose office is over elections, sounding a note of concern and a note of caution about basing any of these things off of unfounded, questions, and that starts to erode a foundation of trust, and it should be only undertaken with the greatest care.
And I spoke with her a little bit about this, and she's deeply concerned. She's deeply concerned about that when you keep putting this out there as if there should be some sort of concern, you're creating a situation where people may feel like, well, if there's all this smoke, there must be some kind of fire, even though there's not any kind of evidence there. And she is really worried that all of these questions from a few different people, a few different quarters, will really wrongly erode confidence in our system.
Yeah, in the interest of this election security, as they're talking about the integrity of it, we'll see what happens with our own legislature. As you mentioned, is we may see a bill on that very issue going forward based on this audit that's about to come. Okay, Lindsay, some big story you've covered of impact that we should be discussing.
You know, one story that I was really proud of this year, and I think helped start a big conversation, was about the Great Salt Lake this year. And of course, our whole region, including Utah, is undergoing a historic mega drought, and the Great Salt Lake, one of our most well-known, iconic natural features, is shrinking. Hit its lowest level ever this year, and it has something like $1.3 billion of economic impact. There are some potential dangers if that shrinking continues, of dust and things like that, and that's something that's really kicked off a big conversation. The governor wants to spend some money to save the Great Salt Lake, and there's a real tension there between how do we make sure the humans have enough water, and how do we make sure that the Great Salt Lake and all the other other iconic natural wonders in our state are also taken care of and don't shrink with the climate change challenge that we're all facing right now. And so for me, that was a big one that I think is important in a really long-term sort of sense for our state.
We've been in a drought for years. As you said, this is a mega drought, but this is the first year we had our political leaders say, you need to restrict your watering of your lawn to 2 times a week. You need to take action. This isn't just wait till the next rainstorm.
And this is a big deal for Utah because we like our green lawns here,
But I think this is going to be a marker. This will be a year that we look back and say that's when it started. That's when our government started taking more significant action. That's when our government required us to take more significant action to make sure that as Utah continues to grow, and it will,
one of the fastest growing states and one of the driest,
that we can have enough water.
And it was impactful, not just from the state leaders urging us to do caution, but from a local government perspective, I have never had more conversations with my constituents about how we were watering our parks, whether or not we ought to keep splash pads open. In a record hot summer, as well, where people are still concerned about how they recreate and safely recreating with COVID, outdoor activities still felt safest. Outdoor activities in the summer are hot, and so we were having conversations throughout the summer with our residents about where we were cutting back, how we were handling golf courses, how we were handling splash pads, how we were watering turf that kids were playing on for sports, and trying to take care of high use areas, but let other areas inside parks and things like that go and become, proudly brown as part of those conversations. But it was very much on the minds of local governments in a way that in my council service has not been a significant conversation we had.
Kate, you work so closely with the legislature. Put this in context about what they're willing to do. Significantly, the governor, even when he released his budget this past week and a half, did it from the banks of the Great Salt Lake.
Absolutely. And he has put money in his proposed budget to study, to preserve. That is a key signifier. Interestingly, Speaker Brad Wilson, whose district includes Antelope Island, so it's a significant part of his district, has announced that he's hosting a summit on the Great Salt Lake for January 5th, which is the first time we've done that. So you have, I think, absolute interest and concern from the governor, willing to put, his budget dollars where his mouth is on saying this is a priority. You have the legislature signaling they agree. So usually when you start to see that type of agreement, we can expect bills and action this coming legislative session.
Go ahead, Lindsay.
I was just knocking on wood over here. We'll see. I guess it's all going to play out, right?
Before we leave that one really quick, just kind of talk about the arc of this issue, Matt, because the Republicans are on board. This has ended up being an issue that is not partisan necessarily, which has not been the case for a long time.
Well, I mean, when you look at just climate change or water conservation, Utah has not been overly aggressive as some states have been. And But there has been increasing talk of what kind of state do we want to have? What kind of growth do we want to have? We know we're marching forward with a bigger population. We know the state's changing. We can track the weather. There's a point where you have to take action, and our government has acknowledged that. And I think that's a great first step. What that actually is it aggressive enough? What does it mean for individuals or industries or companies? These are the debates we're going to see in our legislature and in the public sphere. And as I said, this will be a turning point because we're going to have these conversations for years, if not decades to come.
Isn't it interesting the arc that this has followed? Because one of the big events of the early years of my life were the floods of '83, and they have always been this thing we've talked about: the pumps at the Great Salt Lake. Just the epic water, and just to see us move from we certainly don't need pumps right now, we need the opposite, and it's just an interesting arc to follow that we are now going to have this serious conversation, and we desperately need to have it.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, Kate, you're up.
I had hoped that in 2021 that we wouldn't necessarily need to talk about COVID as a big story, but it continues to be something that is incredibly impactful in my life, from a personal perspective, from a local government perspective, and from what I'm seeing up at the Capitol, how we continue to handle COVID, the incredible high numbers we still are seeing in our hospital systems. New letters of the Greek alphabet for variants that I didn't know before.
Sadly, we
got to O, and so that continues, I think, to be something that is so important, and it touches so many factors. I was talking about how I started holiday shopping in the summer because of those worries about how it is playing into our economic situation, and so unfortunately, I hope someday we do this show in the new year and we don't need to talk about it. Mm-hmm. But I still think that is one of the biggest things that we have facing us, and it has continued to dominate every facet of our lives in this year.
True.
And the impact on healthcare workers. I mean, the hospitals are still full, and how that level of stress, and even the politics also enter into it too, right? You hear about healthcare workers who have some verbal abuse even kind of thrown at them because they're sort of associated with this pandemic that everyone feels exhausted by, and some people feel like has some all kinds of different implications for different people, and that's one element of this that makes me especially sad, is to see these folks who are working so hard, who are some of the heroes in all of this, at times be also on the receiving end of some of the anger people have about everything that's going on. I think that's an aspect that I would hope if there's anything in 2022 so many things we want to see improved, but that would be one that I would love to see.
I was going to add that when I think of the coronavirus this year, I think about the vaccines, and we have seen demographics and politics play into who gets vaccinated and who doesn't. If you take Salt Lake County, the East Bench and the more liberal areas are more vaccinated than people who live on the west side, which are lower socioeconomic status, more diverse, and people who live in the south end of the valley, which is more conservative. And that plays out not just in Utah, but in the United States of America. And I think it's very interesting when you have the governor telling people to get vaccinated, all of our congressional delegation telling people that they got vaccinated and they encourage it. You have the president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints encouraging people to get vaccinated, and we're below the national average. Like, it shows the power of politics in today's day and age, that there's people who are concerned about it because what they get from the news they consume, and that vaccination rate will play a role into when this ends. And it's a story that we've seen unfold during this year.
Lindsay, I want to get to one more aspect of this too, which we've talked about in the show, even with you at some point, is kind of brings up the question, who makes the decisions? When it comes to vaccine mandates, as Matt was just talking about, it's just so interesting. We had the President of the United States putting some mandates into place, which have been challenged, of course, very quickly. Most of them stayed. Our legislature has some thoughts about who should. The governor, for a while, had some questions about whether or not he was able to do it. Talk about that exchange just a little bit, too. Is it more clear now who gets to make these calls?
In some ways, yes. In some ways, no. And of course, the thing that's most unclear, and well, that always feels unclear is like, what should the calls be, right? It's always hard, like that feels like the line is always moving. But of course, one big one we saw was about schools and masks at the beginning of the year before a lot of school kids could get vaccinated. And there was the law basically saying that school districts couldn't do their own masks. And you saw the mayor of Salt Lake City basically take matters into her own hands and saying kids here are going to wear masks. And there was some political infighting over that, although it continues now. But may play out in the legislative season. I imagine there's still some Republican lawmakers who are still unhappy that she did that, the Democratic mayor. So there are the politics of this are very much in play, and people have very different ideas on how it should be handled. And
the moves and the counter moves are very interesting here, because you see the president announce he's going to put in place these different mandates and gives these different timelines. You see the state legislature swing, the other way, and then there's been this counter swing playing out, and it's a little bit maybe under the radar of some people, dealing with Utah's state Osha plan, and so Utah has a delegated plan, the ability to make rules for health and safety for workers that are as effective but maybe slightly different than what the feds would require. And that was a lever that was pulled on Utah and some other states when it looked like we weren't going to adopt some of those rules dealing with healthcare workers, that then pulled in a whole bunch of non-COVID health and safety plan issues that have had a whole lot of kind of different conversations behind the scenes as well. And so it just goes to show that there are multiple levers that can be pulled to coerce different types of behavior and outcomes, and those are still very much playing out.
Well, they are. And Matt, so some of these are happening straight through legislation. Look what Representative Paul Ray did, or Senator Evan Vickers this past year. The endgame bill, for example, when it comes to there seems to be a lever that our legislature does feel like it's their prerogative to pull.
Yes, our legislature has decided they don't like the power that the governor has wielded before Governor Gary Herbert, now Governor Spencer Cox, that they are the ones that decide if we're in an emergency. They're the ones that decide how we respond to this. And so they have clawed back some power, and the governor has expressed a little bit of concern, but he's largely gone along with it. And so how that, the idea, I think, the legislature had was that we're at the tail end of a pandemic. It's time to move on and reinvigorate our economy and march forward. And we're here at the end of 2021, and I don't think any of us have any idea when the end of the pandemic is going to happen. But it's clear that the legislature wants that power.
Yeah, absolutely right. We got a couple more minutes. Another big issue, another big story that you've covered, you'd like to talk about. I've got a couple of my own, but anyone else you want to talk about?
We were talking a little bit before filming about all the things that were so important that normally would have been high profile. I mean, we have a new governor. The Utes are going to the Rose Bowl.
Thank you for bringing that one up. Yes,
I could not. And so there's all of these things, but we've not gotten to talk about a booming economy because some of these other stories have just been so dominant for the entire year.
Yeah, absolutely right. And any one of these are just stories that you would cover normally that would occupy a lot of time. Let me give a couple that I want to talk about. Let's get to the state of Utah for a second on what you just mentioned, our economy. Record levels of unemployment here in the state, right? So if people want a job, they're largely able to get one. But Lindsay, it's resulted in some big decisions for our legislature because there's a lot of money left also. Low unemployment, issues with growth, and then what do they do with the surplus of funds? Talk about that for a moment.
Right. I mean, some of these are good problems to have, right? And low unemployment in some ways has been a little bit of a double-edged sword. It's good that people can get jobs if they want them, but then there are some jobs that aren't going filled. There's a nationally, we're having a lot of conversations about the Great Resignation and labor shortages, and we're not unaffected here in Utah. And what is the solution there, especially at those service jobs where people are front facing, they're public facing, and they don't necessarily pay tons of money. It seems like that's a sector that's having particular challenges around how do you get people into these jobs and keep them there, and so that's a real challenge, and that's going going to be, it's good to have growth, it's good to have a strong economy, but it's not as an unalloyed good. There's some other things that come along with it.
Well, if you're the legislature and you have this pile of money, and then on top of it, you have the federal government pass an infrastructure bill, like, you're going to have even more money. And so it's a lot. We're going to see a lot of conversation about affordable housing. We're going to see a lot of conversation about infrastructure projects, water projects, bridges. If we're going to, get another rail line for Front Runner, like, there is going to be huge investment in our state, and it will attract more people. And it will, low unemployment will attract more people. It just all feeds into this growth that we're seeing.
Hey, Kate, maybe as our elected official here at the table, this has got to be something you're hearing about, this population, the growth that we are having.
We are having robust discussions as local government and with state leaders about affordable housing and also incentives, what industries we're locating here and why, and how those two tie together. And it is very much a robust discussion that we expect to see legislation on in the session. We are bringing more people. It is bringing housing problems that we have seen other states have, and trying to figure out what other states did that works that we should adopt, what they didn't do that adopt. I mean, I have a good friend who told me about, we all have experienced going to a restaurant and finding it closed because they don't have workers, but a good friend that is with the Manufacturers Association told me about how many openings he's got in those jobs, very high-paying jobs in Utah manufacturing that are short. And so this alignment of housing and how we address some of that density, which is always an uncomfortable discussion for some cities, and how the state attracts more jobs and how locals play into that, is going to be an ongoing discussion. And my hope is, of course, that we continue to have those really positive discussions, because there are these different local nuances that need to also be factored in about how we maintain the Utah quality of life, why we all love to live here.
Mm-hmm. That's going to have to be the last comment on that. These are big and great stories. I'm so glad you were able to give us some context, and for the way you've covered these stories too, and helped as an elected official too there, Kate, as well. And thank you for watching the Hinckley Report. The show is also available as a podcast on pbsutah.org/Hinckley Report, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you for being with us. We'll see you next week.